I used to think loyalty meant something, that hard work would eventually cash in as recognition, that if I kept showing up day after day, early in the morning, long after sunset, holding my breath through tight deadlines, and letting my accomplishments speak louder than any brag, I'd earn my place in something real, something solid, something that wouldn't vanish with a memo or a shrug. But I was wrong, so very wrong. And the morning I stepped into HR with a hopeful heart and left with a burning hole where my worth used to live proved it in ways I'll never forget. I wasn't just the first person in the office most mornings. I was the heartbeat of that floor. The kind of worker who said yes before anyone else even read the request, the one who mentored new hires without being asked, who wrote internal manuals in my own time, who volunteered to troubleshoot client problems when everyone else dodged them. And still, none of it saved me the moment I was no longer convenient for their bottom line. And the worst part is, I actually walked into that HR meeting smiling, like a fool, clutching my half-finished coffee and mentally preparing a modest thank you speech, just in case it was about that bonus I'd been subtly chasing for 6 months straight, the one they'd nodded vaguely at in my last performance review. But the second I saw Lisa's face, tense, pale, avoiding my eyes like I was a ghost, I knew something was wrong, and the truth hit even harder than the silence that came before it, when she slid a white envelope across the table and said, in a voice drained of warmth or regret, "We've reviewed your position," like she was reading it off a script. And before I could even process what that meant, her mouth kept moving, like a train that wouldn't stop, like my feelings didn't matter. And effective next month, your salary will be reduced by 60%. And just like that, 60% of my income vanished into her carefully rehearsed HR voice, as if it wasn't the difference between survival and collapse, rent and eviction, food and fear. My mouth opened, but nothing came out for a second, because my brain was glitching from the sheer audacity of it. And when I finally managed to sputter, "Wait, what? 60%?" she added, like a punchline to a cruel joke. "It's that, or you're free to find other opportunities," with a fake sympathetic tilt of her head, as if she'd done me a kindness, as if I should be grateful to be given such an insulting choice. And I laughed. God help me, I actually laughed, short and sharp and so bitter it scratched my throat, because it was easier than screaming, easier than flipping the desk and telling her how deeply they'd failed. Not just me, but every worker who gave their soul to a system that saw them as disposable. And when she didn't laugh with me, when she just stared like I was being unreasonable, I felt something inside me split, like a clean tear down the center of my identity. And I realized in that exact moment that everything I believed about effort, about recognition, about playing by the rules, had been a lie they fed us to keep us obedient. And the betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal, because I wasn't some forgettable assistant. I'd built the onboarding system their new hires used. I'd trained Lisa's own niece when she joined as an intern. I'd covered shifts during holidays, led crisis meetings when our project manager bailed, smoothed over client disasters that should have landed me a raise instead of a warning. But none of it mattered. The second Greg and his board decided to cut costs, and apparently my entire livelihood was a line item they could erase without flinching. And the sickest part is that Lisa couldn't even look me in the eye while she did it. She who once cried in my office about her divorce, who asked me to review her niece's resume after hours, now reduced me to a problem she didn't want to feel guilty about solving. And I don't even remember how I made it back to my desk. Just that the world felt like it was tilting, like I was watching myself from the ceiling, numb and trembling. And when I sat down and tried to type, the letters blurred through tears I hadn't meant to cry. Tears I had swallowed for months, maybe years, now suddenly breaking through with a violence I couldn't contain. And I locked myself in the restroom and texted my mom with fingers that shook, writing, "They just cut my salary by more than half." And when she called me instantly, I didn't answer, because I knew the second I opened my mouth, my whole body would fall apart. And I couldn't afford that. Not yet, not while they could still see me. So I sat there in the stall, silent and shattered, while outside the door, co-workers I'd covered for, defended, supported, walked right past without knowing or caring what had just happened to me. And the injustice of it burned like acid in my lungs, because I realized then that this place was never a family, never a team, never anything but a polished machine that would eat you alive if you hesitated to breathe too loudly. And that night, when I got home, I didn't turn on the lights, didn't take off my shoes, just collapsed onto my bed, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling, while my laptop blinked with incoming emails, congratulating me for exceeding expectations on last week's client pitch. The same pitch that brought in a contract big enough to cover 5 salaries for a year. And I laughed again, more hollow this time, because nothing makes sense in a world where you can outperform every metric and still be punished for it. And as I lay there in the dark, my tears ran hot, not just from sadness, but from rage, because I had broken myself in half to be everything they needed, and all they saw was an expense to eliminate. And the worst part, they thought I'd just take it. They thought I'd nod and smile, and keep working twice as hard for half the pay, because that's what I always did, because I never made noise, never pushed back, never asked for more than what I earned. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't see behind my shaking hands and red eyes, was that they hadn't fired a weakling. They'd awakened a woman who had watched, learned, and quietly kept receipts. A woman who knew where the bodies were buried, who'd seen Greg skim money from project budgets and assign contracts to his cousin's fake company, who'd watched Lisa bury harassment claims in internal folders labeled training notes so they wouldn't get flagged by audits. And while I never said anything before, while I played their game and kept my mouth shut, I wasn't going to let this be my ending. Not now. Not when I had nothing left to lose, because broken women are not weak women, and they just gave me the perfect reason to burn their house down, starting with one phone call they never saw coming. The kind of call that doesn't just shake floors, it collapses entire empires. And as I lay there, gripping my pillow like it was the only thing holding me to this earth, I whispered to myself, "They think this is the end, but this is only the beginning." I didn't storm out, didn't slam doors, didn't throw my badge at anyone's feet like they probably expected. I stayed, calm and composed, lips sealed, heart on fire, and behind every fake smile I gave, every good morning I tossed into the break room like a decoy, I was building something far more dangerous than outrage, patience, strategy, a fortress of facts layered with the very evidence they never imagined I'd have the nerve to collect. And in staying, I became something more potent than loud. I became invisible. Not because I shrank, but because I sharpened my presence into a whisper they couldn't detect. And invisibility, I discovered, is the most powerful armor when your enemies think they've already broken you. I watched Greg laugh too hard at his own jokes in glass-walled meetings, while Lisa tilted her head in mock compassion toward the next restructured employee, both of them so intoxicated by their control that they never noticed the woman bringing in donuts every Friday was watching them like a hawk in heels, memorizing every misplaced file name, every careless smirk, every whispered, "It's just business," as they justified another life flipped upside down. And while they high-fived in boardrooms and patted their own checks with the money they stole from mine, I became the office's most dependable ghost, agreeable, invisible, and always happy to help, which gave me access to the very rot they thought was too hidden to touch, starting with emails buried in forwarded threads where laid-off employees were mocked like punchlines, their personal stories twisted into office gossip and budget spreadsheets that screamed bias in glaring red, cuts that only ever fell on the shoulders of women and single mothers, conveniently labeled as low-priority roles, while their male counterparts with lower performance reviews got raises and extra PTO. And as I filed those receipts quietly into a secured, encrypted drive I named Dustproof, I also started mapping out the power structure I once believed in, realizing that half the upper floor was related by blood or marriage to someone else in leadership, which meant nepotism had built the staircase. I was punished for not climbing fast enough, and every day I dug deeper, I found darker corners, Slack channels where Greg made wildly inappropriate jokes about junior staff, and Lisa responded with emojis instead of intervention. Off-site events billed as networking that were nothing more than private parties, where interns were pressured into drinking too much and told to lighten up if they flinched at boundary-crossing comments from department heads. And the deeper I went, the more I realized how insulated they were by their own carelessness, how they operated like no one would ever have the courage or clarity to stitch it all together. But I did, and I didn't just stop at company files, because I wanted to make sure this wouldn't end in a quiet HR investigation that got buried like all the others. So I reached out to people they thought were long gone, former interns, contractors, ex-managers, anyone who'd walked away with scars and silence. And one by one, they answered me, slowly at first, like trauma survivors afraid to say it out loud. But the more I shared, the more they opened up, and what began as private messages became long, whispered phone calls filled with cracking voices in unfinished sentences, like Harper, a former senior manager I'd always admired, who told me through tears that she'd lost her home after Greg sabotaged her promotion and blacklisted her across the industry for emotional instability, when all she did was report him for inappropriate conduct during a conference trip. "They ruined me, Ellery," she said, voice shaking through the static. "I lost everything, and no one believed me. And something in me shattered and then reformed, sharper than before, because I knew, right then, that this wasn't just my story. It was a graveyard full of stories they'd buried, careers they'd smothered in silence, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. I felt weaponized, like my rage had found its tribe, and that tribe deserved justice, not just revenge. I even reached out to former compliance team members, the ones who left so suddenly last fall, and learned they'd tried to report financial discrepancies, but were told to focus on company morale instead. And one of them, Ryan, even sent me a list of flagged vendor accounts that mysteriously vanished right before a scheduled audit, one of which, after a few long nights of digging, led me straight to a shell company owned under Greg's wife's maiden name, a vendor that billed tens of thousands for consulting services with no attached work product, And that, I knew, was my golden weapon. The financial fraud they couldn't spin, couldn't clean up with a quick PR statement, because money leaves a trail, and this trail was smeared with arrogance and fire. So I mapped it, dated it, organized it into a detailed timeline down to the dollar. And while I did that, I began building a report, not just a list of grievances, but a professionally formatted, evidence-stacked, citation-rich indictment of their entire empire. A document that could speak louder than any tear, louder than any press release. And as I compiled it, I added voices, anonymous quotes from those who were too scared to go public, but brave enough to be heard. And by the time I finished, Dustproof wasn't just a folder, it was a war chest, a final reckoning dressed as documentation. And I encrypted it with multi-layer security protocols, sent backups to secure emails, hid flash drives in separate physical locations, and still, I smiled every day in that office, refilling coffee pots, laughing at Greg's jokes, complimenting Lisa's blazers, playing their game with such convincing grace that they had no idea the woman they thought they'd broken was quietly preparing to end them, not with fire, but with truth. Because truth, when curated carefully and backed by evidence, is louder than rage and deadlier than revenge. And I wasn't doing this just for me anymore. I was doing this for Harper, for Ryan, for every intern who cried in their cars, and every employee who gave too much and left with nothing. And when I finally looked at my finished report, I didn't feel like the same woman who cried into her pillow weeks ago. I felt like a storm they couldn't predict. And I whispered again, this time without trembling. This is how it begins. I waited until the city was still waking up, when the skies were a murky blue-gray, and the streetlights hadn't all shut off yet. And at precisely 7:32 a.m., the same cursed hour Lisa used to schedule those blind-siding termination meetings, where she'd flash her crocodile sympathy eyes across the table while robbing people of their livelihoods. I picked up my phone, dialed a number I'd memorized for weeks, and let my voice carry everything I'd prepared in the silence, because this call wasn't going to HR or Greg or any meaningless feedback form that would get filed and forgotten. No, this call was aimed like a laser right at the core of truth's amplifier. Lena Cruz, a journalist whose byline alone made corporate boardrooms sweat. A woman known for ripping billion-dollar facades open and letting the world smell the rot inside. And the moment her voice answered, sharp and low, like someone always 2 moves ahead, I said, "My name is Ellery Knox, and I have everything. Proof, documents, testimonies, financial trails, illegal funneling, harassment logs, discrimination patterns, everything they buried. I unearthed it, and you're going to want to see it." And for 20 minutes, Lena didn't interrupt once. Not even when I dropped names she'd likely heard whispered in business circles. Not even when I read out budget lines that didn't exist on paper. And when I finally stopped, heart pounding like it knew the world was about to flip, all she said was, "Meet me, today," and hung up without another word. Because real journalists don't need dramatics. They need the fire, and I had it in both hands. So at 11 a.m., 3 blocks from the very building whose foundation I was cracking open, we sat across from each other at a small corner cafe. 2 women sipping bitter coffee with sweeter intentions, and I handed her a simple envelope with a thumb drive inside and a small burner phone with encrypted cloud access and a single instruction written on the paper beneath, "Go nuclear." And she nodded. Didn't ask questions, didn't need to, because what I gave her wasn't a leak. It was a detonation. And 72 hours later, the world ignited with it, Headlines painted every homepage in digital fire. Whistleblower exposes multi-million-dollar fraud, harassment and discrimination at Presstech Corp. And suddenly, Greg wasn't just a smug CEO with a corner office and a $3,000 watch. He was a headline image on every major business site, his face frozen mid-speech with the words, "Federal investigation, embezzlement, and internal corruption" slapped across it like digital tattoos. And Lisa, who used to glide across the office like a swan dipped in Chanel perfume, was now reduced to a screenshot in viral threads dissecting her emails, her Slack reactions, her apathetic responses to reports of abuse, her signature under countless confidential terminations, now anything but confidential. And the response wasn't just internet noise. It was a reckoning. Clients pulled their contracts, investors dumped stocks, employees walked out in protest, and office chat rooms that were once flooded with happy hours and fake praise now echoed with disbelief, anger, and power. Because when truth arrives in high heels, in hard evidence, it doesn't knock, it kicks the damn door in. And by the time I walked into that building on Monday morning, dressed in the same blazer they once called too bold for a support role, the silence was thick enough to taste. Heads turned like I was a ghost walking back through her own grave. But I didn't flinch, didn't hide. I walked through that glass lobby with the calm of someone who'd already buried the worst of them. And Greg's office, once a fortress of arrogance, was empty. Desk cleared, blinds open, nameplate gone, and Lisa's corner spot vacant. Her things boxed and dumped outside HR with a quiet little email announcing she'd stepped down to pursue new opportunities. But we all knew better, because reputations like hers don't step down. They collapse. And HR tried to save face with a half-baked internal memo about external consultants and temporary restructuring. But the damage was done. The world had seen Presstech's skeletons dancing in plain daylight, and the company's reputation was sinking faster than its stock value. And just when I thought I'd seen every satisfying moment I could have dreamed of, I got the one I didn't even expect. A call from the new interim CEO, a woman named Valerie, who had once sat 2 floors below in legal, and now, suddenly, was sitting at the helm of the whole damn mess. And she asked me to come up to the executive floor, a place I'd never been allowed to step foot in without someone escorting me like I didn't belong there. And when I walked in, she stood from behind Greg's old desk and said, "Ellery, I don't know who you really are, but you just saved this company from complete collapse." And I smiled, but not the kind of smile you give to be polite or appreciated. It was the kind of smile forged in fire, the kind you give when the truth finally speaks louder than the gaslighting. And I looked her dead in the eye and said, "No, I didn't save it. I just exposed what it really was." And for a second, she didn't speak, just nodded slowly, like someone processing the fact that the quietest woman in the building had just flipped the entire narrative upside down. And when I left her office, I didn't feel small anymore. I felt like gravity had shifted in my favor, like all the ceilings I'd been told to accept were now lying in rubble behind me. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about resetting the balance. And in the days that followed, while the company scrambled to rebrand and issue apologies and schedule listening sessions, like those could fix years of abuse, I kept walking forward, head high, inbox full of anonymous thank yous from strangers who said things like, "I finally feel seen," and "Because of you, I'm speaking up too." And those messages felt better than any promotion they ever denied me. Because I wasn't just one woman with a folder. I was the spark that lit a floodlight, and maybe they thought the world would forget, that headlines fade and people move on. But the truth is, once a system gets cracked open, it can never fully seal itself again. And while Greg hires lawyers and Lisa updates her LinkedIn bio like her past didn't get printed on every podcast, I sit here, free, whole, and unashamed, knowing the woman they tried to silence is now the reason they'll never sleep soundly again. You'd think that once the headlines cooled and the resignations were inked, once Greg disappeared behind a legal team and Lisa went full digital ghost, once the building's glass doors stopped whispering my name and the board tried patching holes in their sinking ship with PR Band-Aids, that I'd exhale, let go, move on. But I didn't. Not because I craved more attention or because revenge had hardened into obsession, but because when I finally sat alone in my apartment, free of retaliation and fear, something inside me cracked open wider, something deeper than corporate betrayal, something that pulsed every time I remembered the quiet voices that had whispered, "Me too," during those long calls I'd made while gathering evidence, something that clenched when I remembered Harper crying through the phone and the interns who'd left with trauma no one saw, and I realized the problem was never just Greg or Lisa. It was a system built on female silence, and I'd survived it, yes, but now I had a responsibility, so I called Harper, still shaky, but stronger now, and asked, what if we built something with the ashes? And we did. We launched a nonprofit with the kind of clarity only pain can forge, and we named it the 40% Project, a name that bit like irony and truth stitched together, because that's what they said we were worth, right? 40% of our full value. And yet, we carried whole departments, entire companies, legacies, all while being told to smile more and ask for less. And the minute the site went live with our stories, resources, and mission, something happened that I hadn't expected. It exploded, not just in clicks and retweets, but in testimonies, a flood of letters and emails, in voice memos, from across the country, from every coast and every kind of woman. Nurses who'd been told they weren't leadership material, engineers passed over for younger men, chefs paid half what their male colleagues earned, marketing assistants told to wear heels if they wanted to be seen. And each story poured into our inbox like a chorus rising from years of dust. And I read every single one, heartbreaking and fusing at the same time, until one email stopped me cold. It said, "Ellery, you don't know me, but you gave me the courage to fight. I printed your article and slid it across the table to my boss when I negotiated my raise. I used your name like a torch." And I cried, not out of sadness, but because this was what they tried to crush. And now it was unstoppable. And soon I was asked to speak. At first just a podcast, then another, then a virtual panel for workplace equity. And then someone from the Forward Summit called and asked if I'd keynote the Women in Tech session. And suddenly, I wasn't just a whistleblower. I was a signal flare. And it felt surreal to stand on stage in front of women I admired, CEOs and founders and advocates who clapped when I said, "Silence is not professionalism, it's complicity." And when I walked off stage, hands shook mine, tears met my words, and one woman hugged me and whispered, "You didn't just blow the whistle, you blew the door open." And the momentum didn't stop, because one afternoon, while I was answering emails with coffee in hand, still in my sweats, I got an invitation that made me stare. A high school wanted me to speak at their Girls' Leadership Summit, and I sat in my car outside for 15 minutes before walking in, nervous in a way that TV never made me feel, because these weren't executives or journalists. They were girls, girls with notebooks and big eyes, and dreams bigger than their classrooms. And when I stood at that podium and looked at them, all I could think about was what I'd needed to hear at their age. How many times I swallowed my instincts to stay polite. How often I'd accepted crumbs because the whole pie felt forbidden. And I took a breath and said, they wanted me quiet. But when I spoke, the world listened. And it wasn't a slogan. It was a scar turned speech. And the way they clapped, not because I was famous, but because they understood deeply what it meant to not be heard until you scream through the cracks. And afterward, some of them came up, little notebooks open, asking how to be brave when their voice shakes, how to deal with being called bossy or difficult. And I told them, you be difficult, baby. The world changes because of difficult girls. And their eyes sparkled like someone had finally said it out loud. And that moment stuck with me longer than any news clip, because they reminded me why I hadn't stopped at justice. They needed echoes louder than shame. And that's what I became. And I'll never forget the night I was watching the news half asleep and suddenly saw my own face on screen, not in a scandal, but as part of a feature on whistleblowers turned activists. And the reporter said, Ellery Knox, founder of the 40% Project, continues to amplify voices the corporate world once silenced. And the camera cut to an old photo. Me at my desk, headset on, face determined. And I didn't know who took it or how they found it. But in that second, I imagined Lisa sitting at home, TV remote frozen in her hand, realizing that the girl she tried to discard had become a national voice, and that Greg, wherever he was hiding now, would see my name tied to something more permanent than any boardroom, a movement, and maybe the HR team still sits around, trying to rewrite history, saying they did what they had to do, citing budget constraints and company restructuring. But I know, and they know, and the country knows that they tried to make me disappear, and instead, I became the echo they can't silence, the voice in every backroom deal, now followed by, what if she speaks? The fear they birthed in me, now reborn into power. And some nights, when the wind blows just right, and the city feels quiet enough to remember everything, I stand by my window, close my eyes, and hear those echoes rising, stronger every day. Not just mine, but Harper's, and the interns, and the women who write to me in the dark. And I remind myself that staying silent might feel safe, but it never, ever saves you. And if they wanted safety, they never should have pushed me to the edge, because the woman they tried to silence became the anthem that will outlast them all. As I stood backstage, with the echo of applause still vibrating through the floor, the glowing sign above me read, Keynote Speaker, Ellery Knox, from pay cuts to power plays, and I couldn't help but remember the first time I stood in that same brand of spotlight, except that time it had burned me instead of illuminating me. But now, every inch of the stage felt like ground I had rightfully reclaimed, and the air around me pulsed with energy, not of fear, but of triumph, the kind that only comes when your name has stopped being a target and started being a torch. And as I walked out to face the crowd, I didn't see strangers. I saw warriors, women in every row who carried stories like scars, each of them silently nodding as I spoke, because they knew the terrain of betrayal, just like I did. And when I said, they tried to silence me, now they're forced to listen, the room cracked open with applause, but not the kind you give a performer. No, it was the kind you give a survivor, a fighter, a revolution in heels. And after the conference, I found myself turning down Offer after offer, big-name firms, media appearances, seven-figure VC pitches. But they all felt like new cages dressed in gold, because I didn't fight for freedom just to be boxed in again. And so I said no, again and again, until one morning I woke up, looked in the mirror, and said, if they won't build a world I can lead in, I'll build one they can't lead without. And that's how Knox and Rise was born. Not as a business, but as a battleground for justice, where I brought together the fiercest minds I knew, women who had been buried under companies like Press Tech, but bloomed anyway. And we didn't just train executives or write manuals. We rewrote cultures. We walked into corporate halls with data, strategy, and a smile that said, try me. And every victory we carved felt like a brick in the tower I was building out of everything they once used to break me. But nothing prepared me for the day my phone rang and I saw Lisa's name flash across the screen. Lisa, the face behind that fake HR sympathy, the same woman who watched me drown and called it policy. And when I answered, I didn't greet her. I just waited. And she said, voice brittle like dry leaves, I just wanted to say, I didn't know it would go that far. And all I could think was how convenient it must be to find a conscience after the fallout. And so I let her speak until she stammered, I lost everything. And I replied with all the calm in the world, you didn't lose it, Lisa. You threw it away the day you decided I was disposable. And before she could say another word, I added, you destroyed careers, mine included. You just picked the wrong woman, and then hung up, not out of spite, but out of grace, because some people don't deserve closure. They deserve consequences. And that night, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months, pulled out the letter I'd written the day I got that pay cut, and read the words with tears in my eyes and fire in my chest. One day, you'll wish they paid you less, because that insult will become your empire. And the truth of that hit me like lightning, because every betrayal had been a stepping stone. Every condescension had been a challenge. Every dismissal had been a dare. And I had answered them all with a vengeance dressed as legacy. And the best part, I wasn't alone anymore. There were thousands like me now, women who used my story as a blueprint, who quoted my speeches in their exit interviews, who walked into negotiations with my name written on their palm like armor. And I'd get messages from them at 2 a.m. saying, Ellery, I did it. I walked out, and I walked taller. And every time one of those messages came in, my revenge grew roots, because it was never about just toppling Greg or exposing Lisa. It was about erasing the blueprint of silence and replacing it with one of fire. And as Knox and Rise expanded, so did our reach. We weren't just helping women survive corporate life, we were helping them redefine it. And one day, a teenage girl DM'd me a photo of her wearing a homemade shirt that read, I am not quiet, I'm Ellery Loud. And I cried harder than I had in years, not out of grief, but out of awe, because I never set out to be anyone's hero. I just refused to be their scapegoat. And now, that refusal had become a movement, one that filled college lecture halls and boardroom roundtables, one that made CEOs flinch and investors rethink their strategy, one that started with a 60% pay cut and ended with an empire that paid women what they were worth and more. And sometimes I still think about Greg, wherever he is, Googling himself, seeing headlines that still link his name to scandal, while mine climbs search rankings as a voice of reform. And I imagine that must sting, that the woman he tried to silence is now the standard they measure ethics against. And though I don't seek revenge anymore, I don't deny the satisfaction in knowing that every dollar they tried to save became a loss tenfold, and every whisper they once shared about that angry girl in marketing became a scream heard across industries. And now, years later, when I'm invited to government panels, to global tech summits, to classrooms filled with girls who believe their worth isn't negotiable, I begin every speech the same way. They told me to take the cut or leave, so I cut them out, and I rose. And the crowd never stays silent, not once, because the world may still undervalue women in boardrooms, but not this woman. And every time I tell the story, the old me heals a little more, and the next generation learns a little faster. And that's the kind of revenge that never stops echoing. Not through lawsuits or memos or settlements, but through courage, through resilience, through an empire born of ashes and restructured in fire. Because my name wasn't built in silence, it was forged in war. And now, every time a woman dares to say, "No more," I know my war cry lives on.